Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Langley Lab. Today we are going to go over how to remove the time rounding rules in WFM. If your company is currently using this, you're probably in a state where it permits time rounding, but more and more we are seeing that states are stating that it is illegal to do so or it is unfair to the employee, and in many cases in states such as California and Oregon, it is not permitted. So I will go over why that is. But let's start with a couple of basic terms here. There are pay rules in WFM, and they are basically the way that the system calculates when to apply certain pay rules. So it applies based on company policies or labor laws. And a misconception is that WFM or UKG will just apply updates based on where you're based or work out of, but they do not do any system configuration updates that impact employees' pay on your behalf unless you give them explicit authorization to do so or pay them to do so. So, for instance, if you were to submit a request to UKG to help you remove the time rounding rules, it is a service request, at least as of 2025 when I saw a client last request it. And then there are work rules. Now, work rules define how hours are evaluated on a time card, and it determines when time shifts from regular pay to overtime or other pay categories based on company policies or labor laws. Now, that is different because pay rules calculates the pay and calculates the pay side of things, not the type of work that you are completing. And then punch round rules. This determines how employees clock in and out and how the system will interpret those clock ins. So for example, to the nearest 5-minute mark, 10-minute mark, or 15-minute mark. So if, for example, you as an employee clocked in at 10:08 a.m., the system, it could be configured to round that up to the nearest 15th increment or quarter hour increment, which would make your time officially clocked in at 10:15 a.m. You could see how that might be unfair to the employee if this is consistently how it's done. It's not to the advantage of the employee when it happens like that, but it could be to the advantage of the employee if they clock in at, let's say, 10:05 a.m. and their time is rounded down to 10 a.m. So could be advantageous if the employee is using it correctly, but also could be unadvantageous to the company. So highly recommend removing time rounding rules if you can. Now, data views is another term we're going to use. So if you're unfamiliar with data views, they are reporting tools available within WFM that provide real-time data that you can filter and view and export so that you have table-based formatted information on live employees. Let's say that your boss approaches you and says, hey, Oregon is no longer accepting time-rounded punches for all hourly employees. So let's update our system to make sure that the system is no longer rounding punch times effective March 1st of 2026. And ideally, they're giving you a couple of weeks, if not months, to do this change and to pilot it and test it and fully vet it out. And so you, of course, your star employee, you say, absolutely, I can. And then you will let them know when it's done. Now, I'm going to show you a very scary cake. This is how UKG describes it. They describe this as a cake, and I highly recommend the trainings as they will break down how all of this relates to each other. Now, what I want to focus on is this left-hand side here. They say that you should analyze the connected building blocks from top to bottom, and then implement an update from bottom up. So that helped me to really conceptualize how this update might work and be the most effective. So starting with the very top, analyzing what pay policy the employee is assigned and working backwards to the very most granular level that I could find. So quickly looking at this, I could already tell where time punch round rules was. It was under this area, connected to a work rule, and then connected to a pay rule, and then connected to a pay policy group. Now that's a lot if you're not familiar with this, but don't worry, I'm going to walk you step by step on what we did. So the other cool tool that I want to highlight here is UKG's Worksheet, their analysis process for configuration, which is also an extremely helpful tool to break down that really big, overwhelming cake that I just showed you before. Now, UKG does a better job and they have a whole video about it, but I won't bore you with all of the overwhelming details for now. But let's start off with analyzing the who, the when, and the what. So the who is hourly employees. They are impacted employees. And when, we want it effective March 1st of 2026. And then what? We want to remove time rounding rules. That is our what. And then the second step is to outline all of those building blocks. Now, the first building block we saw in that cake was this punch round rule, which I then notate, okay, which punch round rule do I need to update? Now, one of them is called the quarter hour rule. And who's affected? All hourly employees. Now, I made this a really basic example, but your system might be a little bit more complicated. So then you would make an implementation plan for it, right? So whether a change is required or you need to modify an existing rule, which we highly discourage, especially when it comes to it impacting time or pay. So what I'm going to do instead, and what UKG's best practice is to duplicate existing rules. So what I will duplicate this existing punch round rule and name it no rounding, just to keep it simple. And then, of course, I'm working my way up the cake, up the layers of the cake. So that work rule is connected to an existing rule called knock. And I ran a report and saw that it is affecting all hourly employees, which is our target audience for this change. And best practice, I'm duplicating that rule and naming it a no rounding test, for now at least. And then I can update the name once it is live. And then, of course, the work rule, it is connected to a pay rule, as we saw in that cake earlier. And that payroll name that I'm going to be using is called full-time. And again, I run an impact analysis to make sure it is impacting only the people that I want it to. And then I duplicate it as is best practice, name it knock full-time remove, which is an existing rule, just named it something. And then number 4 of the steps here for this analysis process for configuration worksheet, we choose who we're going to test this on. So you might want multiple test employees, but for our sake, we're going to do one. And then I make a note right here, confirm that time clocks are recording punches as normal as well as web punches, because who knows? Sometimes there are nuances with time clocks where you need to initialize them and make sure that updates push through to that side. Now, the strategy here is to log in as the employee, punch in and out as a normal employee would via the web, via the mobile app, and communications, coordinate with HR and comms to make sure they understand the impact once the testing is complete. Now, step 1 for actually setting this up in the system, this is with the new interface here. You go to Application Setup, Time, and Time Setup. Note, we'll want to identify all the work rules like I did in that worksheet. So for now, we're making note of that, and this is where you would find those work rules that I mentioned in the worksheet, and you make sure that you make note of them. So I went ahead and clicked on New and created that no rounding rule. Well, actually, I duplicated. So I selected this quarter hour one and selected duplicate, and it went ahead and created it. Then I ran this data view called Employee Summary Full to confirm what the active payrolls are for all the hourly employees. So I highly recommend you do that as well. And then I went to the holiday credit area and clicked on Work Rules. And that is where I created a copy of the rule that I want to modify. So that I created a copy of this, and this is a copy of the knock one. Then I went to modify that rule, and this is where I selected the no rounding option that I had configured before. Now, the no rounding, I didn't show it here, but this is something I had to configure in the back end, and I'm basically telling it to no longer round to the nearest 7th minute or the nearest 8th minute. I'm telling it, hey, 0 minutes, like do the exact punch time that the employee records. And then I connect it to that work rule. And then I compare the work rule that is not in use to the new one to make sure that they are exactly the same. And then I can effective date it. So in this example, I was using one that was already not in use, but was a duplicate. So I didn't want to messy the system up. So I just was like, I'll use that as long as it's the same exact one. And so I effective dated it. I selected create a new effective dated version and confirm that this one is not in use. And then I went to my test employee here and went to my payroll and assigned that payroll to the test employee and logged in as them, started clocking in and out, entered the exact same hours before and after the effective date of 9:30 that I had set up. And I can clearly see that if I entered the same exact hours of 10:08 a.m. to 10:35 a.m. prior to the effective date of that payroll, it is still rounding, which I can see the 0.25 hours here. However, after the effective date, I can see that it is no longer rounding and it actually is giving me the full 0.45 of that hour. And I do a little bit of math here by saying, 27 divided by 60, which is 27 is the number of minutes between 10:35 and 8, which is right here, and then divided it by 60 to confirm that that is truly the exact amount of hour that an employee is owed. So things to remember, you never modify an existing rounding rule. Always create a new rule or duplicate an existing one as best practice. Check all dependencies of rounding rules because they may be referenced in multiple work rules, pay rules, and even labor level assignments. So deleting a rule without updating dependencies can cause system errors. So you definitely want to make sure you don't modify existing ones if you can avoid it. Best practice is duplicate. So pilot before you full rollout. Testing it with a small group definitely helps to catch issues before organization-wide implementations. That's just a good idea in general. Communicate thoroughly. Removing rounding rule can result in more exceptions and questions from managers and employees. So clear communication reduces a lot of confusion there. Document everything. Take screenshots of everything before and after. Keep detailed records of your version control separately. Highly recommend using that worksheet UKG recommends. Monitor after go live. Make sure that if you created a new exception to accompany this time rounding rule, then to highlight those, run the actual versus time rounded variance report to make sure there's no variances anymore. That is a standard delivered data view that UKG provides. So absolutely run that to validate that it is working as expected. Now, I wanted to make sure I captured this because I realized earlier in the presentation we didn't have this screenshot. But this is what the punch rounding rule looked like for the quarter hour, where the rounding and the grace period looked like this, and the outside of the hour, the outside looked like this. This is basically saying anything after 7 minutes is going to round up to the 15th, and everything before that will round down. So we just changed it. And down here, you can see the values that we changed it to. And yeah, that's really all it took to change those no rounding. I didn't go to the out punch or the in punch just simply because this customer didn't have the in and out, although it's good to check those as well and make sure that they are not changing it either. So check all of these tabs, honestly, but Just I wanted to give you a brief preview of what that actually ended up looking like for the punch round rules and the change, and to get that result we saw earlier with the test employee. So we hope you found this presentation helpful. And if you have any questions or are curious, interested in working together, absolutely, we'd love to hear from you. And if you can, like and subscribe, it helps us, it fuels us, and gives us a lot of dopamine to continue providing this kind of content for everybody out there. So we hope to see you on the next one. Take care. Bye.